possibility of 3 Big Ten teams. You really couldn't justify moving Virginia Tech up, and if Clemson loses, they're probably out. So I think the big question really is how many teams does the Big Ten get in, and what happens if Washington or Clemson loses? Which of those other 3 Big Ten teams get in? Michigan, number 3 in its division, or Washington, Penn State, whoever wins the Big Ten championship game. So that's really what I'm looking for, and I'm looking to see what the committee does if Washington or Clemson loses.
Let's stick to that scenario right there, Mike. Clemson loses, Colorado wins the Pac-12. You think that Colorado is going to be left out because obviously right now the Big Ten has 4 teams ahead of Colorado. Colorado would have the conference championship, which it appears based on 2014 and 15 is a huge factor in its favor, but maybe not so much as we go forward. You think the committee would go for the 3 teams out of the Big Ten?
I don't necessarily think they would. I think that's the conventional wisdom. If Clemson and Washington lose, I think the winner of the Big 12 championship game, whether it's Wisconsin or Penn State, moves into the 3 slot. I think that's automatic. Now, if Clemson and Washington loses, I think there's an argument to be made that Colorado moves into the 4th spot and jumps Michigan and the loser of the Big 12 title game, which I think is obvious. The loser of the Big 12 would move below Colorado if they won. But if Colorado wins, here's why that big jump is possible. If Colorado wins, that will give them a win over the number 4 team, which would be their best win of the season. Again, when you go back 2 years ago to the Ohio State movement, one of the reasons Ohio State was able to jump those 3 teams is because they won against a highly ranked team, something like 59-3, or it was a huge win against Wisconsin, and that enabled them to make that three rank jump. Colorado can do that. They've got wins against the 18 and 20 team right now. They have 2 really good losses, the number 5 team and the number 11 team, and then that win against Washington would give them a win against the 4 team. Now, the stumbling block there is one of those losses is to the team that's number 5, and that's ahead of them. So the committee would have to justify Colorado with the same record moving ahead of Michigan, who beat them by 17 in Michigan earlier in the season. I think the committee could justify that based on Colorado's overall body of work, which is what I think the committee focuses on most, and that conference championship really enhances that overall body of work. So I think Colorado could move into that 4th spot if Washington and Clemson both lose.
So in your mind, Ohio State's in regardless?
Yes.
Okay. If Penn State wins the Big Ten championship, they obviously, as has been discussed all week, would have the Big Ten championship and would have the head-to-head over Ohio State. But you still feel as though Ohio State would be selected by the committee. But do you feel if you had the choice, who would you select?
In the scenario of Penn State winning and Washington and Clemson both losing in that scenario?
Let's say chalk is the result in the ACC and the Pac-12, and Washington and Clemson win. Penn State wins. What do you think happens there?
I keep it as it is. I think Alabama's the 1 seed, Ohio State's the 2 seed, Clemson's the 3 seed, and Washington's the 4 seed. Again, overall body of work is very important to me, and I think it's what really guides the committee. And that one loss with a conference championship with Clemson and Washington, I think is more impressive than a 2-loss conference champion in Penn State. Again, here's Penn State's problem if Washington and Clemson hold serve is they lost to Michigan by 39 points. I think that's Penn State's big problem.
Yeah, and the big problem for the committee is that what you just cited, to a certain extent, is that Michigan on the sideline, having lost the biggest game of the year, is still 10-2 and has the head-to-head over 3 of the participants in this mess right now with Penn State, Wisconsin, and Colorado, and possibly over a conference champion in 2 leagues. So that would be an interesting thing, although the people at 538.com believe that Michigan's got like a 1% chance of getting in.
Yeah, Mark, I kind of agree with that. I don't know that Michigan really has a path, and I'm not saying as I see it, but I think as the committee sees it, I'm not sure Michigan has a path, and here's why. Once you get down to this, and you really have to get into the nuts and bolts to really figure out who's 3 and who's 4 and who's not going to get in. The one thing that I think really hurts Michigan is they only played 3 games outside of the state of Michigan this year. They lost 2 of those 3 games. I think that's what's in the end. I think that's what's going to kill Michigan's chances of getting in the playoffs, that they lose 2 of the 3 games they play outside of the state of Michigan.
I would hate to see Penn State get left out as a conference champion with a head-to-head win over a playoff participant, and I would hate to see multiple conference champions not get into the field. It's funny to me that Ohio State basically had the same season this year that they had last year, except they lost to Michigan State the week before the Michigan game, so just 2 weeks removed from the end of the season, versus losing to Penn State and having time to recover from that loss. But basically, Ohio State's done the same thing that it did last year, but the committee has set itself up in great position at number 2 and really made it difficult for them to move them down outside of the playoff, having set them up at number 2, defeating number 3. How in the world do you drop them to number 5 after they just beat the number 3 team in the country?
Right. And, you talk about Ohio State 2 years ago, Ohio State last year, and then Ohio State this year. I think while the Ohio State situations might be similar, but the results are different, I think that's more about the other teams than it is about Ohio State. And, 2 years ago, you had the Big 12 fiasco, the Bob Bowlesby fiasco with one true champion ending up being two non-true champions with TCU and Baylor. That's really what cost the Big 12 that year, enabled Ohio State to get in. Of course, they went on to win it. But this year, with Ohio State, it's not so much that Ohio State is not the division winner, because they really were tied for the division win. Penn State won the tiebreaker. That's different than Michigan. Michigan did not rely on a tiebreaker. Michigan was third in the division. Ohio State can claim that they were kind of a division winner where Penn State won the tiebreaker. But what's going to help Ohio State this year is Penn State had 2 losses, one of which was against number 25 Pitt. So Ohio State's 1 loss is really outweighs Penn State's 2 losses, particularly when one of those was a 25th ranked team.
So my last thought here, Mike, concerns Michigan, because I think this is kind of a battle of wits, of logistics and how you view things. But you can obviously stack the teams based on wins and losses, and then differentiate the teams that are 10-2 or 11-1 based on resume. Or you can look at it this way. If you're going from week to week, this same college football playoff committee that ranked Michigan number 3 dropped them to number 5. Well, a number 3 team in the country that went on the road and played the number 2 team in the country to a tie in regulation, took them to 2 overtimes on the road, basically outplayed them. Maybe the game came down to a foot measurement in the second overtime. Isn't that what's supposed to happen when number 2 and number 3 play? And number 3 gets dropped to number 5, while the likes of Clemson and Washington are beating up on Washington State and South Carolina.
Yeah, and that's a fair argument from the Michigan perspective. The Michigan strength of schedule is clearly better than Washington and Clemson's, particularly with Michigan having a really good win against Colorado, 17-point win against Colorado. But then you turn around, if you're the Michigan fan using that logic, then you really have to hesitate using that logic, because then you have Wisconsin right behind you, who has an overtime loss to Ohio State, which is essentially equal to your loss to Ohio State, and then has a 7-point road loss to Michigan in Ann Arbor, and then Wisconsin is a division winner and is potentially a conference champion as well. So again, that's why I think 538 has Michigan having a 1% path to the playoffs, because those teams behind them, whatever logic Michigan uses, there are teams behind them that if they win the championship and one of those teams in front of them loses, they can use that same logic and actually have a stronger case for the playoffs. That's why I think Michigan's path is very tight right now.
Ellie Moretta Felice, who writes for Black Shoe Diaries, it's the SB Nation platform for Penn State, will be joining us in just a minute. I'm sure he's got some things to say about his Nittany Lions and their chances to make it. So, Mike, quickly, before we let you go, you've talked about the scenarios, what could happen, what should happen, what do you think will happen this weekend, and then the selections on Sunday.
Yeah, Mark, I think it's going to be exciting. I look at those games. I think Washington and Clemson are both overvalued as favorites. Washington 6.5, Clemson at 9. But the 2 games I'm going to be really interested in are the MAC championship and the AAC championship. Because if Western Michigan loses and Navy wins, there's a potential. Kind of articles today written about it. There's potential for the bowl selection to be almost the entire bowl selection to be put off for a week. So watch that. On championship weekend, the Navy game has tremendous impacts for the college football landscape, the entire landscape of college football.
Mike LaValle from Last Word on Sports. Check him out at lastwordon.cfb.com. Last Word on College Football. Mike and I match wits from time to time, and I enjoy the conversation, even though I'm typically a loser when we match wits. But, Mike, appreciate you jumping on board tonight.
Mark, thanks for having me.
All right, as Mike sizes it up, Alabama's in, SEC champion or not. Clemson, Washington, they're the key factors in this. And of course, Penn State and Wisconsin seem to a certain extent to be basically the same team with the same resume of sorts, talking generally against Ohio State, which appears to be in despite not winning a division championship or a Big Ten championship. It just can't happen. And maybe Michigan's got an outside shot as well. The Big 12, I just think it would be miraculous for any situation to get Oklahoma or Oklahoma State in. I think the Sooners have decided advantage, so they would be the Big 12's better shot against Oklahoma State. But Colorado would need to win, and Clemson would definitely need to lose in the ACC for Oklahoma to be considered in any way. And then you match up Penn State's resume with 2 losses in the Big Ten, winning a much better conference against Oklahoma in the Big 12. And it just doesn't make sense for the Sooners to make it in any way, shape, or form. All right, we talked about the Penn State situation, and to get a little deeper with the Nittany Lions here and the Big Ten championship matchup against Wisconsin, I'd like to talk to Ellie Moretta Felice, who's joined us a number of times. We've got, I don't know if Ellie's still with us. David Waters is on the line right here
Still
with
here.
Gators Breakdown. Hey, Ellie. How are you?
Hey, how are you? Doing all right. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. What's going on?
Not much. Just put the kid to bed and get some chatter going.
Well, yeah. Well, thanks for taking some time. I'm sure you caught quite a bit of what Mike and I had to talk about, and just throwing your team all over the place, in the playoff, out of the playoff, and so Ellie's joined me a number of times setting up Penn State positional units as we were finishing up August drills, preparing for September. And Ellie, I know you love the Nittany Lions and hope for the best, expect the best, and all that. But when we talked back then and we were breaking down positional units for Penn State, I don't think you were thinking college football playoff at that point.
Not
be
not
honest, right?
necessarily. I happen to be the optimist in the group at Black Shoe Diaries, and I did have one of those like bold prediction posts at one point where I actually predicted that Michigan would lose to both Iowa and Ohio State, and that would give Penn State the division. But when I made that prediction, I was essentially going on the joke that cocaine is a hell of a drug. So no, to answer your question, I did not envision this exact scenario happening.
Because this Penn State team, I think, for most of us, looked similar in talent level and probably in results to what we've seen since the issues with Paterno and Sandusky, and since the program was revived by Bill O'Brien, where 7-8 wins was pretty much the range that we saw these Nittany Lions achieving, and especially after the loss to Pitt, losing by 3 points, it looked like, okay, this is a Penn State team that's going to struggle against the likes of Michigan, Michigan State, Ohio State, get knocked down to about the mid-tier in the Big Ten, and win its 8 games and go to a decent bowl game. And that's what it's going to be, because we saw the definite pluses and minuses. Now, Trace McSorley seems to have been a linchpin in all this in regards to his accelerated play, Ellie, and just being a much more confident and much more precision passer than what we expected.
You are absolutely right. So I'm going to go back a little bit and talk about the first point you made about the record, right? So yes, most of us had predicted that maybe this team would win 8 or 9 wins. 9 would be the absolute best at the very beginning of the season. When the team lost to Pitt, some of our predictions kind of came down to maybe they'll win 8 games, but probably 7. When they lost to Michigan, most of us were essentially saying if they make a bowl game it's probably going to be a miracle. So to turn around and just win the next 8 games straight is just pretty much a miracle at this point. And that miracle was actually made possible because of Trace McSorley's play. The difference between the first half of the season and the second half of the season is that in games against Kent State, in games against Pitt, in games against Temple, you saw Trace McSorley that was very subdued, very error prone. He had multiple fumbles in the game against Kent State. He had fumbles in the games against Temple and Pitt as well. He had an interception in the game against Michigan. And since that game against Michigan, where he went on the press conference after the game and he said he essentially apologized to the fans for that display and said that that would never happen again. And he actually went in and delivered on that promise. Since that Michigan game, Trace McSorley has turned the ball over twice, 2 interceptions. He's had no fumbles. And then the other difference that has made the whole offense better is that he's been able to use his feet more. And it was the first time that it was really apparent was in the Minnesota game, where at the very end, they had to tie to get the game to overtime. McSorley goes on a 30-yard scamper just to get him in like that range to get that field goal to take the game to overtime. And from there, it's been a much more run pass heavy game from McSorley, which then has allowed Barkley to do even more on both sides, right? On the run and catching passes. So yeah, it's just it seems just at the half of that Minnesota game, a flip switch on not just McSorley but like the entire team, where they may have seen their future ahead of them, and they've completely turned everything around since then.
And the reason I'm surprised, Ellie, is, and we talked about this in the preseason, you had a tremendous defensive line last year, and we're seeing a number of those guys play in the NFL. And the defensive line performance was suspect early in the season, especially against Pitt, that had just tremendous offensive explosion against the Nittany Lions, especially in the first 3 quarters of that game. And Pitt's no dynamic offense. This is not Clemson. This is not Oklahoma. And it just seems as though the defensive line, when I watched the Ohio State game a couple weeks after the Pitt game, I thought I was watching a completely different Penn State defensive line. Then on the flip side, the offensive line, not supposed to be a strength, has been maybe the key weakness for this team since Bill O'Brien took over, suddenly gelled. And maybe he had some issues running the football with Saquon Barkley in some of the better games recently, but pass protection's been good. Just both line plays have just progressed just beyond what I thought was possible.
You're right, but I do want to go into a little bit of detail there too. The one thing that is kind of being overlooked, right, is Penn State had 3 new coaches coming into the season. Well, technically 4, with Tim Banks with the safeties, right? So you had Tim Banks in the secondary. You had Matt Linegrover on the offensive line. You had Brent Pry as the DC, and then you have Moorhead, of course, as OC. So there's that vast turnover in coaching, and then you have the turnover on the defensive line, right? And then you also have the fact that from 2015 to 2016, the offensive line depth pretty much doubled. They had about 8 or 9 guys on at the offensive line at the end of 2015, and then by 2015, 17 guys are available to play. So that's one thing. And then the other thing which might be able to serve to better explain the early deficiencies on defense is that by the time Penn State played Michigan, they essentially were out of linebackers. All 3 starters were out. 2 more were unavailable during the game itself. Kevin Givens was out for a certain amount of time. Evan Schwan was out for a certain amount of time as well. Parker Cothran was actually suspended for the first 4 games of the season. And Grant Haley was out a little bit. Malik Golden was out a little bit. John Reed was out a little bit. So at any given point in those first 4 games, pretty much half of the defense missed time. So that goes to explain a little bit of the deficiencies on defense and why the defensive performance seems so stark between that of, let's say, Michigan against Ohio State, because by the time the Ohio State game actually happened, that's the first time in the season that all of the defensive starters were playing. Well, with the exception of Naeem White, who was lost for the season very early. But that would be the first time that the actual Penn State defensive starters, all of them played at the same time. So that's a little bit of like an explanation as to why there's such a stark change in defense, which also in a way kind of explains why Penn State ended up allowing 49 points to Michigan. Doesn't explain why they only scored 10, but I do believe that had all of those starters been in the game, we're looking at maybe more of a 28-10 loss, which is more forgivable than a 49-10 loss. So there's so those are the main components that we're talking about now. So there's a lot of change, and all of it happening at the same time kind of led to the I guess Jekyll and Hyde component that you're seeing out of this Penn State team.
Ellie Moretta Felice joining us from Black Shoe Diaries. It's the Penn State platform on SB Nation. I'm sure you can get Ellie's pick a little bit later on the week, Penn State, Wisconsin. If there's any kind of suspense over who Ellie's going to take in the Big Ten championship game, I got one other thing for you, because, Ellie, I know what you're going to say about the argument between Ohio State and Penn State, and I think you're completely right. Penn State, if they defeat Wisconsin, Big Ten champion, win head-to-head despite the 11-2 record versus the 11-1 record. Unless you disagree with me there, I don't think we need to go there. What I need out of you, Ellie, is to size up this Wisconsin team and what you see there, because one of the reasons I think the Big Ten's the best conference in college football right now, especially the top half of the conference and specifically the top 4 or 5, is defense. Michigan's got a great one. Ohio State has typically a great one. That athletically is a great one. Wisconsin, nuts and bolts, technique. Just talk about fundamentally sound defense. It's about as good as it gets across the nation. This Wisconsin bunch is serious on defense. They're not going to light up the scoreboard, and they're going with their backup quarterback in Bart Houston, as Alex Hornibrook was kind of knocked out of the game. But this Wisconsin defense is no joke. So how does this thing need to play out for you?
If Penn State wants to win this game, there's 2 things that they need to do. They need to avoid being on 3rd and long, and that's where Wisconsin excels. And 2, they need to start fast on offense. If they find themselves in a situation like they have for a good portion of the season, where they're either tied or down slightly at half, Wisconsin is a team that won't falter down the stretch like a Michigan State or a Purdue or an Indiana. So the Nittany Lions really need to focus on being on par with Wisconsin at halftime. They've consistently come out swinging in the second half of games, but this is not a game where I think Penn State can come out and win it if they're down 10, 14 points against a Wisconsin defense that is one of the best in the nation and is second in the Big Ten according to S&P Plus. Only to Michigan is Wisconsin's defense lesser than. So if Penn State wants to win the game, that is one. And then the other, on 3rd down, Wisconsin essentially dares you to throw the ball and dares you to put their secondary on an island. Wisconsin is very good at this, but at the same time, they're also very prone to allowing big plays, which is what Penn State is good at on the other hand. So if they are in a situation where Wisconsin is giving that cushion to Penn State, they need to take advantage of it, and they need to be ahead of the chains consistently if they want to come out victorious on Saturday.
Okay, we saw it last year in the Big Ten championship game. Michigan State winning over Iowa, a 1-loss versus a 0-loss. Winner take all. Winner got in Michigan State. The loser, Iowa, despite just the 1 loss, did not make the college football playoff. It appears to be possibly the same situation with Wisconsin and Penn State, although it's 6 and 7 in the country, maybe needing a little help, and the situation with Ohio State makes it a little messier. Ellie Moretta Felice joining us from Black Shoe Diaries. Ellie, we appreciate the time and you jumping on board to give us some insight into Penn State football. Enjoy the game Saturday night. Try not to get too nervous and enjoy it.
Thank you.
All right. Again, it's going to be a great weekend, and this is basically how it plays out. You've got a number of group of 5 championships, American Conference Championship, Conference USA being played on Friday and Saturday. The MAC with Western Michigan, very interesting because they're undefeated. Then, of course, the big boys play on Saturday when you talk ACC Championship, SEC, the Pac-12, and the Big Ten, with the Big 12 playing kind of a de facto championship. It's a regular season game between Oklahoma State, but the winner will be the Big 12 champion. So kudos to the Big 12 for kind of foreseeing the way this is going to play out to try to make themselves relevant in the midst of these conference championship games. David Waters is a guy that we've had on a zillion times here on Mark Rogers TV, and now college football coast to coast as we launch our first show here on a Wednesday night. David from Gators Breakdown joining us, so you can join him on, SoundCloud, YouTube channel at SEC Breakdown. Where else can we find you, Dave?
Our YouTube channel, Gators Breakdown, as well, and iTunes, as you mentioned, SoundCloud, all those avenues there for Gators Breakdown. Pretty easy to find, and as long as you type in Gators Breakdown somewhere, I'm sure you'll find it.
All right, Dave, sounds good. Well, let's dive into the SEC Championship, and I so much, not as much as you, but I so much wanted the Gators to win over Florida State to set up a possible chance to get into the college football playoff. I would have made the argument with 2 losses and having defeated LSU, Florida State, and Alabama consecutively, the Gators earned that as winning possibly the best conference in college football. That hasn't happened. So we've got a Florida team that for the second consecutive year, Dave, and we talked about it, outside of the quarterback position, this appears to be, for someone like me that tries to watch all the games and see everything that's going on, looks like a similar Gator team. Relies on defense, the great secondary, the special teams. You got the better kicker. You didn't have one last year. But difference at quarterback and more of a pocket passer and more of a consistent player in Austin Appleby versus Treon Harris. But kind of compare the Gators right now and the way this season played out versus kind of what you expected.
Really, of course, it was Luke Del Rio coming into the season, not Austin Appleby. And from all the talk of Jim McElwain, sounded pretty confident in what he had Luke Del Rio transferring in. Even rumors before the season started that if he had been available to play last year, he would have started over Will Grier. I don't think anybody in the world believes that right now with what we've kind of seen happen to Luke Del Rio and how he kind of faltered down the stretch, especially after he got hurt. Did that have anything to do with how he played after the fact? Maybe so. But, Austin Appleby came in, stepped in. He played a Tennessee game, led him to a 21-0 lead. Offense got conservative. Tennessee's defense got hot. And we know what happened there. Played very next week at Vanderbilt. He's not the only quarterback that would struggle against that Vanderbilt defense. We've seen it. So, then Luke Del Rio comes back for a couple games, gets injured again. He hasn't played since the Arkansas game. Austin Appleby has started the last 3 games for the Gators against South Carolina, where he looked good. The Florida offense used his legs a little bit. Should have scored more points in that game than they did. But a turnover in a goal line situation. But then the very next week, didn't play great at LSU, but had the one big 98-yard touchdown pass to freshman wide receiver Tyree Cleveland. But he only had 7 completions that game, 7 of 17, I believe. So, not necessarily the greatest stats there as well. And then we saw completely where he had no time to throw. against Florida State. And when he did have time to throw, he missed open receivers down the field. There were plays there for Florida to make. Even as bad as it looked, there were plays there to be made. Austin Appleby just couldn't hit the throws. So it's going into this Bama game with playing against another good defense that's going to suffocate this Gators offensive line. Can the Gators get anything going on offense?
Well, I guess if there's any hope in what we've seen to date, it's the LSU game against Alabama and taking the Tide to a no-score game with about 10 or 12 minutes left, and LSU just played lights out on defense, and we know that those two defenses are comparable, and the two offenses outside of Leonard Fournette, maybe there's some comparisons that can be made there. Alabama appears to be the best team in the country. They appear to basically have no weaknesses. Have you been able to find one?
No. I mean, they are the number one team in the nation right now for a reason. If anything, you might can point to, they've had some injuries in the defensive backfield now, but Florida's not necessarily the team that can take advantage of that. They don't have the quarterback to take advantage of that. Florida's only way to win this game is going to be to ugly it up. It's going to have to be the LSU-Alabama type of game. It's going to have to be the Florida-LSU type of game. It's going to have to be a touchdown game at halftime, a field goal game at halftime, either way. If Florida can be up by halftime by a touchdown, they'll take it right now, believe me. So there's a lot of things to point to how Florida can do that. It's good. First starts with defense. Can the defense show up again? So many injuries, and they keep piling up again. Duke Dawson probably now won't play, so that hurts Florida's base defense. So there's a lot of things to look at as why Florida doesn't have a chance in this game, but we keep pointing to the injuries, and we keep pointing to how can the defense keep playing well, and they do. They did their job against Florida State last week. The offense couldn't get anything going. Offense gave them bad field position. So, if you look at this Florida defense, can they do it one more time? Can they rally around Tabor and Wilson and the secondary guys that are so well? Because Jared Davis may give it a go. He's going to try and play. He's the heart and soul of that Gator defense. If he can go, maybe it lights a spark. And if Florida defense plays their best game of the season, maybe they can hold this Alabama offense down to something and keep it an ugly, close game.
The game that we saw last year was pretty much the formula. So that's what you're looking at this year. We're looking at Antonio Callaway had a first half punt return for a touchdown. The defense was spectacular. You had a lead, maybe not at half, but close to half. I think it was like 9-7 at half. And even though statistically Alabama just ran all over Florida, statistically it was lopsided. And by the eyeball test, watching the game, it was lopsided. It was a one-score game somewhere in the third, fourth quarter, and then Alabama got out to 2 scores and maybe 3, and then Florida threw a long touchdown pass to get within 2. But you were within range for about 3 quarters.
Right. Now that has to be the formula, and and we've seen it, we've heard it many times. You give a team that is not supposed to have a chance, and the longer you keep the game close, the more they think they have a chance. And maybe you get lucky. Maybe one big play. Maybe there's a Jalen Hurts as a true freshman. Maybe this Florida, this good Florida secondary can bait him into making a mistake. This defensive line is still playing very good. They're still deep there. Maybe they can shut down the running game, and it's going to be very interesting to see how Jeff Collins plays Jalen Hurts. Does he get aggressive but your problem there, if you play aggressive, you worry about him maybe busting a run, for 30, 40 yards. Or, if you sit back, do you sit back and let him try and pick you apart? He's not the best passer. We haven't seen him pick many teams apart with his passing game. So I think that's kind of what we'll see. We've seen it the last couple of weeks with this Florida defense. They're not bringing a lot of pressure. They're trying to keep everything in front of them, trying to keep the big play from happening. And while the yardage is kind of racked up, it's kind of worked for the defense. They haven't let up a lot of points. If the offense doesn't turn the ball over like Austin Appleby did last week, where he fumbled deep into their own territory a couple of times and set up some short fields, if Florida plays a turnover-free game like they did at LSU, a very low penalized game like they did against LSU, they'll have another chance to keep this game ugly. And it's asking a lot. You're playing the best team in the nation. Keep going back to this LSU game. Well, we already know Alabama's better than LSU, 10 points better than LSU, and LSU was hyped for that game. So it's yes, these are things I point to that Florida can do to make this a game. Question is, Can they? And not many people are giving them a shot.
So you go to your platform of choice here, whether that's SoundCloud, YouTube, iTunes, and you look up Gators Breakdown. You check out David there because I track him down anytime I need to talk about Florida football because he's the guy to talk to. So, David, before we let you go, what do you make of this national mess in terms of the playoff system and the committee selections to date? What do you expect them to do? The Ohio State situation with definitely not winning a conference championship but being 2 in the country. And, how do you see this thing playing out? What would you value versus what you see maybe the committee valuing at this point?
I'm a big head-to-head proponent. It's what college football is about. What's the use of playing the games if head-to-head doesn't mean anything? But it's so hard to sit here and say Ohio State is not one of the best teams in the nation right now. What is the college football committee, college football playoff committee came out? They said we're taking the 4 best teams. They didn't say they're taking the 4 best conference champions. So but my thing is we don't know what they value. They say they value conference championships, but this is the ultimate test this week is to see what they value. And 2 years ago it was, they didn't value the TCU and Baylor's. They valued didn't value TCU enough to drop them 3 or 4 spots just to drop them completely out of the playoff. And this year I don't see that happening with Ohio State. They're going to be in the playoff. I don't see any absolute way they're not in. With what the committee was saying, pretty much you could read the tea leaves that they thought Ohio State was one of the 4 best teams in the nation. So what happens with that 4th spot? If Clemson wins, Clemson's in. Do they value a Big Ten champion over a Pac-12 champion? I think that's going to be the deciding factor probably in that 4th spot. Is it another Big Ten team who wins the title, or is it Washington if they win their game against Colorado?
They basically backed themselves up into a corner and led us to where we are now when there was a line of 1-loss teams, and they put Ohio State at number 2 in front of all of them. And then Ohio State runs the table, and how do you possibly – and I know I've heard all week, TCU, they did it to TCU, completely different situation. TCU was number 3. They beat Kansas. Kansas, one of the 5 worst teams in the country, the final day of the season, and they got dropped back to number 6 because teams were winning conference championships and leapfrogging them with better resumes. Ohio State just beat the number 3 team in the country. So consider Alabama hasn't lost a game. Ohio State and Penn State basically have the 2 best victories, according to the College Football Playoff Committee, in the nation because they beat the number 2 and 3 teams in the country. So I could even argue that Michigan shouldn't be dropped from number 3 to 5 because they just lost to the number 2 team on the road in double overtime. But that's for another day.
One question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
What happens if Clemson and Washington lose?
Okay. Clemson and Washington lose. If I'm running the show, Bama's in, the Big Ten champs in, Ohio State's in, Colorado's in.
Okay, Michigan beat Colorado.
Michigan did beat Colorado. Colorado won a Pac-12 championship game and won the conference and won 1 more game than Michigan. I get it.
Okay.
But I would understand that argument. And that's the interesting factor in this that Michigan has is there are 3 teams playing conference championship games this weekend that Michigan beat, and they've got the same record as those 3 teams. It's great. I love it. It's a mess.
Yep.
And really the only way I figured out that it's not going to be a mess is if Washington wins, Clemson wins, and I guess if Wisconsin wins, because at least Ohio State can say we beat them head-to-head and we've got a better record. So even though the Badgers have the Big Ten championship, it would be Ohio State, Washington, Clemson, Alabama. That's about the cleanest situation that can result this weekend. All right, David Waters from Gators Breakdown. Join him on SoundCloud, YouTube, or iTunes, and you get your fill of SEC football, specifically the Florida Gators. All right, David, thanks for jumping on.
Thanks, Mark.
All right, so this has been a pilot launch of Mark Rogers TV's College Football Coast to Coast. Will come your way every Wednesday night. You can join us at this point on Facebook Live or on YouTube Live. Thanks to my crack director Marty McPadden getting the job done. Join us throughout the week. We've got videos on YouTube for college football fans all across the country, every team, every conference, breaking it down with bloggers and broadcasters that bring you the insight that only they can for their particular team and conference. Everybody out there, please enjoy championship weekend. It should be a great one regardless of who you're rooting for, and this is why we love college football. See you next week.